Hey there, welcome back to Intro to Python Skills for AI, powered by Capital One. This is episode 5. If you haven't already seen episode 4, click or tap right here to go and watch it, because at the end of the episode, I set you the biggest challenge yet in this series. And it was really a test of all the skills you've learned so far. But if you have had a go, how did it go? Did you nail it first time? Did everything go perfectly? Did you run into some problems but then get everything working? Or did you see it as a bit of a hurdle that you didn't quite manage to get over? No matter which of the 3 groups you're in, that's totally fine. Sometimes with programming, you'll see a challenge and you'll be like, I know what I'm doing here, I've nailed this. And sometimes you'll get a bit confused. But the more you program, the more you'll run into situations where you recognize patterns or can vaguely figure out what's going on. So that's why it's really important to practice. But if you have it a go, let's go and take a look at my solution. Now, a quick disclaimer. Your solution might be different to mine, and that's actually totally fine. As long as you're getting the right output, that's the important thing here. Now, I'm going to talk you through why I'm making the decisions I am, but if you can justify the decisions you've made, that's totally fine too. And one final thing. If when programming you ran into situations where it was wrong the first time, but then you ran it again and it was wrong again, but then you changed something and then it was getting righter and righter until you got it right, that's normal in programming. You're not actually expected to get the answer the first time, so don't worry, you've got this. But as a reminder, our challenge was that I wanted to see 10 lists of random numbers. The first list should have 0 items, the second should have 1, the third 2, and so on and so forth. And each list will print a random integer between 0 and 100 for each item. And so we've got an example in our challenge.py file on how it should look. And there's a little bit of a hint. Now, first of all, I know I need random numbers. And I could, work out a way to generate my own random numbers, or I could use the module that we already know exists. Now remember, I can do import random, and this library, this module has tons of functions in it which we can use, including randint, which generates a random integer, which is exactly what we need. Okay, second of all, I'm going to go and split my code into 2 sections. So first up, I'm going to make a function, and I'm going to call it def generate random list. That's going to take a number of items. So don't worry about this function yet. We're going to work out what this is actually going to do in a minute. But I know that one thing I'm going to have to do is run it 10 times because we want to have 10 lists of random numbers. So I'm going to say for, make sure we don't mess up indentation, for I in range 10. And in range 10, I want to say random list equals to generate random list. So use the function we just made. And I'll explain what that does in a second. And I want to print the random list. Because remember, we're trying to get this list printed into our console, just so we've got all 10 lists like the example says. Now, a few things you're probably asking. 1, what does this I mean? So remember, for I in range 10, I will be the number of times we've gone through the loop. So the first time it'll be 0, the second time it'll be 1, the third time it'll be 2, and so on and so forth. And this number will automatically increment for us. We don't need to worry about it. Our code will actually just do it for us. And remember, range 10 means we'll go 10 times. So in Python, that'll be 0 to 9. Because remember, we start counting at 0. And every time you go through this loop, I want to print the result of random list I. So the first time it'll be random list of 0. Second time it'll generate random list of 1, and then 2, and so on and so forth. And that's going to be passed in as a parameter to our generate random list function. But now we need to go and generate the list. Now I'm going to do that by making an empty list. I'm going to call it random items. And this is going to store the items that we generate. And I know that I want to return our random items. But now I need to create random items and make it actually a thing. Now I'm going to do that by creating a for loop. So I'm going to say for I in range number of items, So remember, range 10 is just a parameter for the range function. So we can absolutely pass in, something dynamic. So in this case, for the parameter of generate random list, whatever is set a parameter there, we're going to loop that many times. So if it was 5, then we'd be looping 5 times. And I'm going to say for every single time we loop in this loop, we're going to random items dot append. So we're going to add an item to the end of a list. And I want that item to be a random integer. So random.randint. That's between 0 and 100. And then the reason this return is outside of a for loop is because I only want the function to return once we've gone through the for loop the correct amount of times. If you return inside the for loop, then chances are it'll return the first time we go through. And that's not really what we're looking for. So now if I go to my console and I try running it, so I do python challenge.py, fingers crossed, yes, there we go. And then if I run it again, you'll see the numbers are different. And if I run it again, they're different every single time, because remember, that's what randint does. If that's a bit confusing, feel free to take a look at my code. Feel free to go and put print statements in to see what happens. Feel free to go and, just change bits around, see what it's doing. Because the best way to learn code is by programming. And so if you want to have a play around with this and use it for something else and change how it works, that's totally fine. For example, if you wanted to loop through 5 times, we could just change this 10 to a 5. And that's one of the great things about splitting this into 2 separate chunks. We have a function that will generate our random list, and then this loop that says how many times. So we don't need to worry about that logic being across multiple places or being difficult to find. We know for sure where it is just by looking at our code. Congratulations! You managed to complete the basic part of this series. You learned about loops, variables, functions, imports, and even more. And these are all things you can now use in your toolkit when programming. So give yourself a pat on the back. You've done really, really, really well. And it's now time for us to move on to some slightly more advanced stuff. By the way, if you want to test how you did, you can go and head over to this link to go and take our quiz. It's just a couple of questions, but it's a great way of assessing your knowledge. But what are we going to get up to next? Well, next up, we're going to start trying to use our Python skills to create a chatbot. So head to this URL and let me talk you through how this works. So in the first box, called the text field, a user enters a person's Twitter name. And then in the second box, they enter a message. And then the Twitter name and message are sent to the app. Okay, so this app then uses a library called Beautiful Soup. Remember, libraries are like the random library. We can import them into our code. And Beautiful Soup is a web scraping library that will scrape up to 10,000 tweets from the user using their Twitter API. Now, this app uses another library called Flask, and this is a web library. It will handle requests and the responses. I'll give you a bit more info on that just a bit down the line. Then, finally, the app will return one of the tweets to you. So it'll get as many of the user's tweets as it can, and then it will return one of the tweets entirely randomly. So I've just talked about quite a lot there, but let's get you up to speed first before we dive into building this. First up, I want to introduce you to web scraping. Now, lots of information on the internet is just text. Now, for example, a Wikipedia page is just text, and your tweets are just text. Now, Python has some libraries that let you easily scrape that text. And what scraping means, it means collecting all the code from a web page and kind of copying it into a file that you can then use later in your program. And most libraries have documentation to help you learn how to use the library. So don't feel like you're going to be entirely alone with this. Just because you don't know how web scraping works, and just because, the library sounds a bit scary, doesn't mean it will be. I'm going to be here, but also the library's documentation is for you as well. Remember when we looked at documentation last time and it was super useful? Now, you can head over to this link to check out the Beautiful Soup documentation. Now, you're not going to use it today, but get used to reading and learning from documentation. It's a really, really important skill for developers to have, and it's what I'm going to be looking at throughout this course too. So, how are we going to build this app? Well, first up, you're going to make a copy of some of our starter code on Glitch, just like you did for the first 4 episodes. Then we're going to take a look through the code, and then you're going to write some of the missing code yourself. And this is going to be a really good way of improving your skills and getting a little bit more advanced with what you're building, because this is an actual app that does actual things, rather than just being individual files which aren't really connected to each other. Now, this may sound like a lot of steps, and part of programming is to learn actually about how all of these different tools work and how they all learn together. So I know you're going to be able to do it, but don't let all of these difficult moving parts be off-putting, because I know sometimes people get a little bit scared and they're like, I can't deal with that much at once, but actually, I'm sure you can. Now, there's a few things I want you to keep in mind over the next couple of episodes. First up is that the majority of the time, when something isn't working with your code, you probably just made a typo. For example, it's super easy to miss out a colon or put a space instead of an underscore in your variable's name by accident, miss out a bracket or anything like that. We all do it all the time, so just keep an eye out for it. And before you kind of move on to debugging techniques, just make sure you actually have typed everything properly. Second of all, is one of the really cool things about Glitch is it has a rewind feature. So if your code was working and then it suddenly stops and you're not quite sure what broke it, you can use this rewind feature to kind of go backwards to back when it was, and you don't really have to worry too much about breaking things. Breaking things is part of programming, so feel free to go in, break something, and then if things all go wrong, just undo it with the rewind feature. And finally, it's okay to make mistakes. Programming is tricky, and you're a new learner to it very possibly. So if you're making mistakes, that's fine, because you'll know to not make the same mistake again in the future. And if you do make the same mistake in the future, then you're probably not going to make it for a third time. Okay, remember when I said the best way to learn programming isn't by talking about it, but by actually doing it? Well, that still applies. So let's jump back into it. I want you to go to the link that's on your screen right now, and it'll take you to a new Glitch project. When you're there, I want you to click the Remix Your Own button. Now, one thing I want you to be aware of is that this project is slightly different to the last one we all worked on. This time, instead of it being lots of separate files that don't really talk to each other, we're going to be building out one application where everything does talk to each other. Everything is building into a wider piece. So, don't worry if there's things you don't recognize here. I'm going to explain the things we need, and there's going to be some files which we'll worry about a little bit later in it too. So, first up, I want to show you what's inside this static folder. We've got our logo.svg, which is just the logo that's going to go on our page. We've got script.js, and what that is, it's a JavaScript file which adds the bot responses to the box on our web page that we saw. We've got style.css. Now, a CSS style sheet is what makes it look good, your page. So we'll have our HTML, and that will lay out the structure, and we have our CSS, which makes it look good, and then we've got the JavaScript that makes our front end interactive. And our HTML, in this case, is stored inside the templates folder, and it's called homepage.html. We've got config.py, and what this is it tells Glitch how to run our app. We're going to be setting some of the settings inside it ourselves. We also have main.py, and that is the Python file that handles the requests and the responses for our file. So when a user types a message into the chat box, that is where the message is sent, and it's where the bot works out what to do with it. Now, we also have this Twitter scraper fetcher file, and this is what we're going to be writing our code in. And it's what scrapes the tweets from Twitter and puts them into our application. We've also got readme.md. That was the folder or the file we were on earlier, and it tells us a bit about our app, how to install it, and the things that we need to know if we're a developer working on it. There's requirements.txt, and this is for Python more than it is for a human. And it tells Python the dependencies or the libraries or the modules that we need to make this application work. And it will install them if we start our application. And finally, we have resources.txt. I'll show you inside that in just a couple of minutes because it contains a ton of useful things we're going to be using inside this app. Now, I'm not going to go through every single one of these files, but you're welcome to pause the video here and go and take a look. In fact, I really recommend you do. If you're a developer working on a new project, it's a really good idea to get familiar with the code before diving into it. But it's time for us to go and dive in. So I want you first of all to go and run the Glitch app. If you've forgotten how to do that, don't worry, it's as simple as pressing show and then pressing next to the code. You can open it in a new window if you want, but it's easier for me to put it next to my code. Now, let's have a go at using this application. So I want to chat with @mlhacks, and I'm just going to go and say hello and send my message. But it can't process it. I wonder why. Well, that's because we haven't actually written the functions here to make it work, and that is what is going to make our app successful. So let's go and do just that. But before we do, I want to teach you a bit about environment variables. If you open your .env file here, you'll see that there's just a load of things that look a bit like settings, because that's exactly what they are. Now, if you downloaded this file to your PC or your Mac or whatever you're using, you would see that it was just a normal file, kind of like a text file. But Glitch gives us a nice interface to go and use just to make our life a bit easier. Now, environment variables are what we can use for, in this case, authentication, and is what we tell our code, is say Flask uses port, we're running in this environment, and all of that kind of stuff. But the reason environment variables are important is because it lets you put stuff like credentials in a place that is not inside your code. Imagine if I had a server and that's where I deployed my code to, and it had a database and people went to my website and they put data into that database. But then I needed to test my app. Well, I wouldn't test it on the real one with the real database contents, because imagine if it contained a database full of emails. I wouldn't want to go and send a picture of my cat as a test to all of those emails. That wouldn't be very good. Instead, I create my own database as a developer and I work on that, because that way I can just put in all my emails and send myself lots of cat pictures. But then that's great, but how do I make my code? If the code is set to use the database that's on the server, how do I make it use my local database? Well, you would really struggle, and you don't want to have multiple versions of the code for different environments. That's just not very fun. So instead we use environment variables, which let us say, hey, on my local laptop, I want to use this database. And, in production on my server, I actually want to use this database. They're two separate ones, but that's fine. We can use environment variables for all sorts of other things, such as API keys, credentials, for, setting config options. The possibilities are endless, and I really recommend you use them in your projects. In this case, on your screen right now is what I want you to go and set these values to. These are here to make your life a bit easier, and it means that we don't have to worry about things breaking. So don't worry too much about these specific values, but the ones that our Glitch app is expecting. Make sure you spell everything correctly as well, because if you don't, you're going to run into quite a few issues later on. When you have got them all put in, we are ready to go. Glitch will conveniently auto-save it for us. So let's head back over to Twitter Scraper Fetcher and write our first bit of code. Now, to give you an idea of what these functions are going to do, first of all, we have get elements. That's going to go and scrape the Twitter website, and it's going to return all the data from that account. Then our get user tweets function is going to turn that data from a bit of a mess into something a bit more usable inside our code. And then finally, clean tweets data is going to get rid of all the things we don't need. So for example, it's going to get rid of emojis and links and mentions and all that other stuff we just don't really want. But we're first of all going to get started on get elements. Now, we're going to use libraries called requests and beautiful soup to do our scraping. And this getElements function has one parameter, Twitter handle. So we know the name inside of it, or who we're trying to get the tweets for. So I'm going to go and make a parameter called URL, or a variable even. And I want you to see if you can make this URL equal to our Twitter profile URL for that person. So for example, if I entered mlhacks as my Twitter handle parameter, then it should go and make URL equal to https://twitter.com/mlhacks. Pause the video, see if you can do that. Well, let's see if you fell into the trap I think you might have. I'm going to go and say URL equals Twitter URL add mlhacks. Well, not actually mlhacks, so is it? We've got a parameter, so we're going to use Twitter handle. But what is this Twitter URL in capitals? Well, if you look on line 11, you see that we actually did set a variable to twitter.com, and that was called Twitter URL in capitals. And since that's not inside any of our functions, it can be accessed by every single function in this file. But why would we do this? Why is this better than just putting a URL in the function? Well, the reason for that is it means that if Twitter ever change their profile URL structure, for example, and make it twitter.com/@mlhacks or /profile/mlhacks or anything else, we only have to update it in one place in our code rather than in lots of different places. And you might be saying, well, Twitter's never going to change that. But what if they do? YouTube did, and plenty of other services have done. So make sure you are preparing for the future when you're programming. And if you think something is going to be used in multiple places in your code that could change, make sure you're saving it in an easy to edit way. Okay, so we've got our URL. Now let's go and do a request to the URL. I know how Beautiful Soup and our request library works. You don't necessarily need to know, but if you wanted to go and learn a bit more, check out their documentation using the link on your screen right now. So I'm going to say response is going to equal to requests.get, and I'm going to get it from the URL we just set using headers equal to user agent agents. Okay, what does this do? Well, agents is set here. It's a variable, and it goes and sets things to something to do with Nokia. And our headers are what is sent with our request to a web page. Your browser, when it loads a website, actually is just doing a request to the server, which then returns the website. And user agent is basically saying what device we're using. And we're actually saying, hey, bot, pretend to be a Nokia 3510, which is a very old phone. But why on earth are we doing that? Well, the reason is so we get a much simpler website back. We don't want the fancy new version of Twitter with tons of JavaScript and tons of difficult to parse things. Instead, by using this, it means we're getting a much simpler version, which is going to make our life way easier. Then, when we've got our response content, I'm going to set a variable called HTML to response.content. And that is going to equal to literally the HTML that was returned. Pretty easy, right? Okay, so we've got our HTML, but we need to use that HTML inside Beautiful Soup to go and split things up in a way that we can actually use it in our code. Because at the moment, it's just one big string. So I'm going to go make a variable called soup. And I'm going to set it to equal Beautiful Soup HTML.parser. Okay, but what does this actually do? Well, soup is equal to a new Beautiful Soup object. So a new copy of Beautiful Soup that we can use however we want. We're then going to say, hey, Beautiful Soup, I want you to analyze the HTML we just got using your HTML parser. as in your thing that can understand HTML. Okay, now we have got all of our kind of HTML inside Beautiful Soup. Let's make our function return something useful. We'll get rid of the pass. The pass is just so the code doesn't error out before we put our return function in. And we're going to say return soup.find all content container tags with the class contained within the content class name variable. Okay, but what does all of this actually mean? Well, on Twitter's website, it's going to have lots and lots of different things. It's going to have headings, and it's going to have pictures, and it's going to have all the tweets as well. And what this is saying is look for all of the divs on the page, because they're currently stored in a div, that have the class of dir-ltr. And I want you to return all of those divs. And what this effectively means is it's looking for something that looks like a tweet and returning that bit of HTML for us. If that's a bit confusing, don't you worry. We're going to dive into actually how to use that very, very shortly in the next episode. But I would recommend taking a break now because coding can be a bit stressful and a little bit tiring. So take a break, go and look at what we've done so far. If you're confused about anything, try making it printing to the console, take a look at all the different files and try and get your head around what we have here. And then in the next episode, I'm going to go and talk you through how we're going to make our getUserTweets function and how we're going to go and clear up the data so that our bot actually does something. And with that, well done for today, and I will see you in the next episode.